so much for joining us today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Simona Capisani on her talk today on centering climate's mobility justice. So I'm going to first introduce the Institute for Contemporary Ethics because I'm not sure that everyone might be familiar with it. So this talk is based at the School of Philosophy at the Northwest University, and it is based within our we've got an institution here called the Institute for Contemporary Ethics, which aims to address the complex challenges affecting our present day societies, lives, and environments through philosophical research, educational programs, and community collaboration. And we've got three kind of main streams within the Institute of Contemporary Ethics. The one is kind of society, the other one is technology, and then we've also got the environmental stream. And this talk is our first talk within the environmental stream. So we're very excited to have you all here today. And then it's my privilege to introduce to you Simona. Simona is currently an assistant professor at Durham University in the United Kingdom. And prior to joining Durham, she was a research associate at the Climate Futures Initiatives in Science, Values and Policy at Princeton University, administered by the High Meadows Environmental Institute and the University Center for Human Values. She is also an associate of the Mahindra Humanities Centers at Harvard University. So we can see that Simona is very esteemed, and we're very lucky to have her here. Her area of research and teaching speciality are in political philosophy and ethics, with a focus on issues that intersect matters of climate justice, international and local governance, philosophy of immigration, gender and global and social justice. She's currently working on addressing the moral, political and governance challenges of climate mobilities, which refers to voluntary and forced immobility and migration, including in situ adaptation, external and internal displacement, refugee flows, managed retreats and planned relocation that are influenced by climate variability, slow and rapid onset climate impacts. And I think as we are in this massive climate crisis at the moment, these are increasingly relevant issues. And we see it even in our own country in South Africa, where we're having more kind of increased weather patterns, increased droughts, increased floods. So it's sort of very topical to have someone like Simona here with us today. So without further ado, welcome Simona, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yolandi, and thank you everyone for having me. It's really a pleasure and a joy to be here at the Institute for Contemporary Ethics. And like Yolandi just mentioned, I'm actually really excited for our questions in the Q&A to hear a lot about what's happening on the ground, where you're all located, and we can kind of talk about the more general things that I'm going to be discussing here in more specific and applied ways, given the current context that some of you may be familiar with. So that's really exciting for me. What I'm going to try to do is give a little bit of an overview of this larger project I'm developing within the context of a book monograph and across several published articles, but I'm also working in a lot of interdisciplinary and co-authored spaces. So this particular talk today is based on a co-authored piece that I'm doing with my colleague, Hélène Benaviste, who's also at Harvard University. And I will see. Okay, there we go. Hopefully you can see the slides. Hélène focuses on policy and environmental politics and governance issues at Harvard. She was currently doing her PhD at Princeton University, and then has been at Harvard now for the past couple of years. And she and her, just a little origin story, but I think this is like a helpful thing to share, especially for those that are interested in sort of impacts that doing philosophical work can do. But I've been trying to share my work in interdisciplinary spaces, and she approached me and said, hey, some of the moral obligations that you're laying out in your normative framework seem to speak to or have a lot of import for certain kinds of things on the international climate governance regime. And so we started talking, and then this particular focus, which is looking at the ways that the moral framework that I'm offering has specific implications and directs particular attention to how to revise the status quo in the current global climate regime regarding climate mobilities. That's what emerged out of this particular project. And so we'll get into kind of the scope of the problem that we're addressing with climate mobilities that I address in the project, and then also kind of go into the nitty-gritty of the framework. And then I'll try to spend most of the time focusing on the applied aspects and can hopefully elaborate on some of these things in the Q&A. But the talk will roughly follow this structure where I'll first try to articulate the challenge of climate mobilities, kind of try to give you the full complexity. Oftentimes it's not framed as such, as we'll find out in a second. I'll also then briefly cover a couple of normative approaches, a few different kinds of frameworks that try to establish how we might see that we have moral obligations to do something about the impacts of climate change on human mobility. They all have a series of shortcomings and leave some gaps. And so we provide a different framework that takes some of the benefits of some of the other proposed, but also addresses those gaps. And so I'll lay that out. And then I'll argue the kind of import that that has for looking at a particular policy space, namely the Paris Agreement and its current pillars, to discuss how the issue of climate mobilities ought to be addressed within that framework, particularly going forward in light of the kinds of progressions we've seen with loss and damage. And so some key questions that we ask in this paper, and then I look at more generally in my research, is given that the current institutional setup itself has a series of gaps and is not yet best designed to address the full range of outcomes when climate impacts human mobility, we ask the question, how can we address the full range, or can we address the full range of climate mobility outcomes in both our moral theorizing, and then how that moral theorizing can show whether or not we can do that in particular kinds of institutional arrangements and setups. And so that's the kind of ground that I, as a philosopher, working with folks in the social sciences, attack that problem from those kinds of two sets of questions. All right, so just to lay out the argument right out front, and then hopefully we'll be able to substantiate it throughout the talk, we're going to argue for this moral framework, this normative framework that we refer to as the livability framework. So we say that the nature of our obligations to those that are displaced by climate change are grounded in an obligation to protect the right to a livable space. And so this normative framework, we argue, lays the foundations to evaluate relevant governance mechanisms and points to some that are better than others and how others can be improved to address the full range of climate mobility outcomes. And like I mentioned, I'm going to draw on some other approaches that have been loosely mentioned that have some gaps. So those are proposing that climate mobility should be addressed through refugee law. Those that think that we can address our full range of our obligations merely through humanitarian frameworks. And then the kind of shift that's been happening in the international regime about looking at loss and damage. And ultimately, we'll show that loss and damage is a relevant way to carry through and address this issue, but in the current form, in the current international protection regime, it's not sufficient, and we lay some possibilities of how to make it so. And the strengths of the view that we're going to argue for is that it captures the heterogeneity of climate mobility outcomes, the full range of those outcomes. It does so, we argue, by laying a moral foundation for how we can address ex ante and ex post claims to protection, which means that the framework shows why we have obligations to protect people when their mobility is impacted negatively from climate change and to address the harms that result, but also to protect people before those kinds of harms occur. And that also, in several of the other approaches, there gets into these kinds of sticky conversations about causality and how those relate to responsibility. And we circumnavigate some of the stickiness of that and try to lay out a foundation that avoids some of those, I think, problems with the other views, but eventually then laying the groundwork for what an international governance scheme can be evaluated against. So it sets this kind of criteria for what an evaluative governance scheme can look like. So briefly, I've been saying the word climate mobilities. It feels like a weird way to even speak about it. Oftentimes, you might have heard the problem referred to as the climate refugee problem. And I want to first try to make sure that we're all on the same page as understanding that there's actually a tremendous degree of complexity to this issue. And it explains why I'm going to be referring to it as climate mobilities instead of climate migration or climate displacement or a climate refugee problem. So on this slide, here's just like a sampling when you come across this issue in usually the media sphere or in the kind of colloquial ways that we tend to talk about climate change's impact on human mobility. And when I'm saying the word climate mobility or climate mobilities, when those of us that are working in these spaces in the literature are using that terminology, we are using it in terms of the range of consequences that climate change has and will have on human mobility. So that's the kind of general, definition. But the dominant narrative that's appeared in the context of most of the public discourse around this has really focused on, like I said, migration and displacement, but only also of a certain kind. Mainly, the concept that comes to you when you think of the climate refugee is someone who's crossing international borders, what we call external migration. So this idea that the entire issue of climate mobilities is really just this phenomena of when climate impacts force people to move out of their countries and towards other countries. And there's always this kind of suggestion that that movement is problematic in part because it requires this movement of a large shift of people from climate vulnerable territories, mostly conceived in the global south, and they're moving towards the global north. And I want to complicate this picture for you a little bit. For those of us that have been working on this, it's actually not that simple. It's not that limited. While that is an aspect of the phenomena, it's not even the most dominant form of the phenomena. And so why I'm taking the time to kind of walk through some of the empirical notions about this issue is that when we're doing philosophy and we're going to try to give a moral account of what we owe to people that are impacted in this way, if we're merely conceptualizing of the problem as a cross-border migration issue, we might limit the scope of the moral domain and miss the ways in which we actually have a much more expansive notion or a different notion of what the moral wrong that's involved with negative impacts on climate mobilities. Okay, so how is it more complex? Well, in several different ways. We should think about climate mobilities as having two sides of the same coin, immobility and mobility, and that we're going to understand different kinds of ways in which even immobility and mobility differ. So depending on the context, climate change can either induce more movement, but that movement is likely going to be within rather than across borders. So movement is there, but mostly involves internal as well as some cases of external movement. And recall, like I just said, in kind of popular discourse, really the focus is on external movement, but it contains both kinds of movement. And like I said, on the other side of that coin, there's also the case of immobility. And what we mean by immobility is kind of how it sounds, right? Sometimes climate impacts prevent or cause people not to move. And in the case of this climate outcome, there's various degrees of agency, even with that as well. And so what do I mean by various degrees of agency? People not moving or moving may have more, people may have more or less agency in the decision making or more or less agency in the capacity to choose to stay or move. So you have agency happening at various levels, both in movement outcomes and in non-movement outcomes. And so I have a couple illustrations here that hopefully will make this a little clearer. So as I was just saying, right, mobilities are not just about international migration. It's just one type of mobility outcome among many. And when you're looking at these kinds of, so what I have here on the left side of this slide is showing, right, laterally that you can have more or less movement. So movement itself is understood as a spectrum where mobility has kind of one pole at not movement, which is of course immobility. And that also, depending on the range of resources available to people or the kinds of contextual constraints that exist in a particular area, the results, the outcome, the mobility outcome from climate impacts might cause people to have more or less choice to do the kind of, engage in the kind of outcome that they want to do. So already we're starting to see there's a lot more complexity here. So these pictures should hopefully, help to illustrate what's going on here. So starting from the top left picture, you see this case of displacement, which is often one of the main mobility outcomes people think about, right, with the climate migration. And displacement in this category, as you can see, is something that where there's a high degree of movement, right? So it's part of the mobility phenomena, but a low degree of agency. People don't have a lot of choice. They're being displaced across borders. But like I said, that's not the only possible outcome. The picture on the top right illustrates the fact that migration can actually be understood and is often used as an adaptation strategy to climate change impacts, which means that people choose and can choose or have the resources to be able to engage with movement. So there's high degrees of agency sometimes in migration as well. That's often dropped out of the conversations, right, that you see in the newspapers, where it's simply a matter of people like being impacted upon, as opposed to also like having that kind of decision making where there's choice in the movement. Now, the bottom two pictures illustrate cases of immobility. So with the bottom right picture, that's highlighting the option that you can actually understand adapting to climate impacts when you choose to stay in situ and succeed in staying in situ as a type of climate mobility outcome. If you don't want to move and you're able to not move and limit the risks in staying in place, that is also part of this phenomenon. So, for example, you might be able to change certain kinds of crop growing practices to facilitate that kind of in situ adaptation. Conversely, the picture on the bottom left is just an illustration of the fact that climate change is expected and already being experienced, right, to deplete resources in some of the most deprived areas. And then those are the very resources needed to migrate. And so this various, this type of immobility is not necessarily by choice, but that they're often referred to, for better or for worse, as trapped populations, people that maybe either want to move or maybe want to stay, but the risk levels they're exposed to in being stuck are really heightened. So, it's not a successful adaptation outcome. Okay, so these various mobility outcomes lead to these various risk levels for the populations involved. Why is this a helpful conceptual picture? Well, hopefully, now that we know a little bit about what climate-related mobility can be conceptualized as, we can understand how it gets instantiated in practice. And again, then the implications of our moral framework to have to try to address that. Now, the current international protection regime, unfortunately, tends to take on the same kind of biases as you see in popular culture or in media presentations about this. You're not seeing a kind of wider focus on that whole dynamic I just explained, but rather a kind of narrow focus on the current idea of cross-border movement, particularly framed as displacement. So these are some examples here of the different kinds of mechanisms within the international protection regime that have addressed climate mobilities to some degree or another. Excuse me. So for example, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is often referred to the GCM if you're familiar with it, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Framework for Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. These have all, to some extent, started to address the problem, but in this narrowly focused way. And so they ignore immobility. They focus mostly on cross-border movement without addressing internal migration too much. And so we want to try to get back to these fundamental principles, the starting points, like ethically, what is owed to people whose mobility is impacted in these various ways? Do we even have the possibility of having a moral framework and being able to establish then who owes what in light of, meaning who is responsible for fulfilling those obligations? And so that leads me to just looking very briefly at some of the different kinds of structures that have been put in place. But as the philosopher, I'm interested in the underlying moral substructure that establishes how these frameworks are carrying out the obligations. So the first proposal, which is relatively lacking, but has been put forward, is trying to understand the climate mobilities issue as a refugee issue, and says we should expand or revise the current refugee convention and the legal regime around refugees to include such a thing as climate refugees. And the sort of underlying normative logic of that is this principle of non-refoulement, which prevents states from sending refugees back to their home state if doing so would leave refugees subject to certain forms of persecution. There's a number of issues with this. I'm happy to speak a little bit more about the Refugee Convention in the Q&A, but largely this paradigm has problems in light of what we're trying to focus on for several reasons. So others are going to say it's really hard to classify someone as being persecuted under climate conditions, et cetera, et cetera. We're focusing on different shortcomings of it, which is that it really only focuses on moral obligations kicking in, and therefore policy to kick in, policies to protect, when people have already, right, been displaced, where they're already having the negative impacts of mobility, right? And that movement understood as this type of only cross-border migration. So where is its shortcoming? It doesn't really lay any kind of foundation for preemptive or preventative measures. So, right, it can only really address ex-ante claims to protection. Similarly, again, it's overly narrow. It only focuses on cross-border movement, and it doesn't even attempt to address immobility in any way. So moving towards the more dominant notion of what we owe to people impacted by climate mobilities, oftentimes you'll see that this is what happens mostly in the policy space. Humanitarian approaches are, addressing a kind of underlying moral structure that accounts for responsibility, or that a duty to aid or protect is really understood more as a duty of charity. It's a state's philanthropic kind of motivations to address the problem, or maybe that our obligations to address the problem really can be articulated as a notion of goodwill, or somehow out of concern for people in need, or maybe even in the acting state's own benefit, because it can help like put down some fires that might occur later for them. And so in these kinds of cases where you have these kinds of charity-based justifications for intervention, they often are ad hoc. It's up to the decision of any one state to see whether or not they have an obligation. It can be really tied to state interest. It's maybe addressing injustices, but not necessarily in a kind of overarching, principled, and systemic way. And also the very notion of responsibility that's attached to these humanitarian conceptions. The thing that we kind of try to stress the most here is looking at the ways in which it really is, again, response focused, like the climate refugee scheme, right? You can't kick in on a charity-based sort of notion of addressing people in harm's way if the harm hasn't really already occurred. And so states might assist those who have been displaced by some, disaster, or determine how much emergency protection they're going to be allocating. But really, those judgments have to be based on whether or not the conditions actually amount to desperate need, or whatever else enters into the state's judgments about what's important. So another kind of major issue with these is they can be inconsistent approaches. There's no principled way to sort of apply obligations to protect, and so there's a kind of gap, right, that leads to many gaps in protection that doesn't address the full complexity of the climate mobilities issue. Finally, this brings me to, and the one that we focus on the most, the last conception, both moral and understanding the structures that we have here available to us through loss and damage. So many of you might have, heard about L&D. I'm happy again to give some background for it, but most likely you've heard about it because of the increasing focus in the last COP, right, where a number of different countries have been advocating to add to the mitigation and adaptation pillar this notion of loss and damage. So a new fund has been developed to fill gaps in the current landscape of institutions to address the kinds of things that don't fall into the mitigation and adaptation categories. And it's in the pillar of loss and damage currently that the climate migration displacement issue has been kind of shoved in by the UNFCCC. And so there are a couple of things that I'll address right now about L&D. But after I kind of introduce our framework, we'll speak a little bit more about how we see the potential of L&D, but it's also here looking at its current shortcomings. And so, again, important to note, this is the only way in which climate mobility is currently being addressed by the Paris Agreement. It is broader than the other approaches, so it's advantageous in that it's not narrowly focusing in the way that the refugee and the humanitarian paradigms have, but it only really considers from a responsibility perspective reparative actions rather than preventative ones. So like the other views, it's, well, when there's been a failure to adapt, or when there's been a failure, right, to prevent any other kinds of harms, this is when this obligation kicks in. And currently, some other shortcomings here is that the discussion of how we should understand responsibility attached to loss and damage actually really hasn't been fleshed out. There's a lot of open ground, and that our paper is kind of inserting ourselves into that open ground space to start to think really carefully about how we ought to understand L&D going forward. Just in the philosophy literature, there's some folks doing some really awesome work on loss and damage. Kian-Min Swu is one of them. My colleague is at Cork University. And him and some co-authors have addressed that you can understand loss and damage in kind of two different interpretive ways. One's the beyond adaptation interpretation of loss and damage, where loss and damage just refers to any kind of actions that address climate impacts, including impacts on mobility, after adaptation and mitigation measures have been implemented. So it's whatever's left over when you fail to adapt and you fail to mitigate the harms of fossil fuels. And the harms from climate impacts. There's a different interpretation of loss and damage, is often referred to as the risk tolerance approach, where loss and damage is referred to as whatever is a response to whatever is deemed as an intolerable risk, when that notion of what is an intolerable risk is defined by the communities themselves that are being impacted. And adaptation is distinct from L&D on this interpretation because it refers to responses to keep risks in a tolerable range. So it's not the kind of on-off switch of fail to adapt there for L&D on the beyond adaptation approach. But the important thing to note that on both these different interpretations, whichever one you're going to argue is the actual case that you're seeing in practice, they both are similarly problematic for us in that they're, again, only addressing ex post responsibilities. And therefore, their focus is a bit too narrow. It ends up focusing on mobility outcomes that only increase risk levels, instead of also understanding that we might have obligations to facilitate mobility outcomes that decrease risk. So it's kind of only focused on the negative. Okay, so what are we doing here? In light of all these kinds of gaps from these other kinds of moral approaches, we ask and we propose another normative framework for addressing climate mobilities. And this framework is based on what we call the right to a livable space. And what we take the kind of underlying normative structure, the moral framework itself, is to see that this is a type of right that emerges out of the very social practice of how we organize the earth within the context of the Westphalian state system. So important thing to note here, one, we're not endorsing carving up the world in the way that it was, post-Westphalia. Obviously has introduced a number of different issues, colonial injustices, etc. But the important point to note is, in light of that structure, understanding it in a particular way, understanding it as a social practice, and I'll say what a social practice is in a second, reveals that it has certain constraints on it that we haven't noticed before. And one of those kinds of constraints is to secure this basic right to a livable space. But we haven't really recognized that this has been a constraint on the state system, because for a long time we continue to understand certain assumptions about the structure of the state system without recognizing that climate change introduces a host of conditions that require us to shift certain kinds of practices within that shared understanding. And so what do I mean by the state system understood as a social practice? I'm drawing from certain kinds of social practice-based views in philosophy, but the kind of most general sense of what a social practice is it's a kind of practice that coordinates actions of a bunch of different agents, in this case, states and state actors, according to some presumed shared ends, in the case of the Westphalian system, it was justified to bring about stability, peace, and insurance of basic rights, unlike the feudal systems that it replaced, and that it achieves those ends through widely recognized shared social understandings. And so I argue in other work that some of these shared social understandings of the nature of the state system reveal to us why there is a right to livable space and why that right is something that obligates us to address climate mobilities. So what are some of these kinds of shared understandings of the state system? I articulate them as two aspects of its territorial nature. One, that the state system is territorially all-encompassing, and two, that it's territorially exclusive. So what do I mean by these things? Well, namely, the Westphalian system ended up, in a simple, kind of way of understanding it, carving the surface of the earth up, right, into discrete sovereign states. So there's this kind of territorial notion that you're dividing all inhabited land under some sort of state authority that's expressed through notions of sovereignty. And that in being like a fleshy embodied being as we are, you're going to be located somewhere on the surface of the earth that has been carved up in this particular kind of way. And so there is this really like territorial nature to it. It also has a territorially exclusive nature. What do I mean by that? Well, depending on where you're situated, you're most likely going to be within the purview of that physical space's sovereign authority. And that way of carving up the system and that source of justification for why you're under those particular notions of sovereignty is because that way of organizing the planet as we've done it so far is the way to achieve peace, stability, and protection of certain basic rights. One thing, though, to think about is, of course, if you're within one particular sovereign domain, you are excluded from another. And namely, the place where you find yourself, roughly considered, is supposed to be responsible, right, for ensuring that your basic rights and needs are met. So if you want to think about the problem, the moral problem of refugees, part of the problem is that they've become excluded because the places where they're situated, they're subject to persecution. And that establishes an obligation to not send people back into conditions where they would be excluded. To reach its shared aims. So this decentralized territorial structure is usually, justified on the grounds that it helps to achieve its presumed central aims. But given its all-encompassing territorial nature, if you are going to exclude people under kinds of claims to sovereignty, you cannot, right, like fail to ensure that they're going to be included at least somewhere, right? Because a failure, right, to meet those criteria of inclusion will amount to a failure to meet the very requirements that justify the state system structure to begin with. So that's a really rough and quick way of understanding kind of the normative shape of the framework. Now, why have we not noticed this right to livable space? Well, lots of other kinds of insurances against exclusion may have worked so far, but under conditions of climate change, they're decreasingly able to do so. So, for example, someone's assurance that they're going to have birthright citizenship, if they are on a Pacific low-lying island nation that is constantly being subjected to rising sea levels, the very fact that they have citizenship within that state may not matter if that state is solely being submerged underwater. They will become maybe de facto stateless, right? So it's an example where things like birthright citizenship and other kinds of assurances under conditions of climate change are no longer sufficient to block against the foreseeable failure that people might find themselves excluded in a territorially exclusive system. So what I argue in some other work, and what's relevant for our arguments here, is that what emerges from the social practice, you don't need any kind of external justification for why you have these rights. We're not claiming some natural rights-based view, but rather based on your understanding of the practice itself, you have to understand that this basic right emerges from it. It's basic in the sense that its security is indispensable for the full enjoyment of other kinds of rights whose protections are an aim of the state system. So I'm taking on board a kind of Henry Shue notion of basic rights. And what do I mean by livability here? What does it mean to have a right to a livable space? Well, livability should be understood as this type of way of being, right, in a particular space. It has this phenomenological component. So you're not merely just like existing statically in some kind of, territorial geographical space, but you occupy spaces in a very relational way, both to others and the very infrastructure and institutions that you are engaged with. So I understand livability as a type of functioning. I can get into that a little bit in the Q&A, but for our purposes here, hopefully it's just sufficient to understand livability as a kind of co-constitutive relationship to space, where I as an individual or as a member of a community should be able to exercise the agency in shaping my environment while also having the environment shape me. I can't constantly just be constructed by the environment acting upon me. So when the right to a livable locality is lost, right, when someone's home becomes uninhabitable, and if all states have exercised their right to exclude because they say it's not my responsibility and I can claim sovereignty for not having to deal with that problem, when everyone is refused assistance in that uninhabitable space, you're effectively left with nowhere to literally be in a territorial state system. And that's where this legitimacy condition is triggered. So when the right is compromised, when it's at risk, or when it's lost, there's a lost capacity to rely on these kinds of relationships to space that are required by those of us are required that the state system protects, because it's the kind of thing that affords you agency, meaning making, and meaningful participation in the state system. So securing the right guards against the kind of foreseeable failure of being excluded by this system. The failure emerges, of course, by the exclusionary nature of the system. Under conditions of climate change, that becomes an even greater risk. So securing the right to livability should be understood as a legitimacy condition for the state system's practice. Okay, how does this whole framework then help us to think about climate mobilities? Well, if we have these obligations to prevent against these unjustifiable forms of exclusion, that means, like some of the other frameworks, we do have protection obligations to address ex post claims. So if you have already been displaced, or if you are seeing yourself as rendered stuck, right, you have to address that state of exclusion because it amounts to cases where the right has been violated and harms have been ensued. But we also have obligations to address ex ante claims to protection. So something unique to this framework that the other ones don't have is that there is an obligation to address foreseeable failures, because that's what helps to protect those shared aims of the social practice to begin with. And so it amounts to a type of precautionary principle that says, look, states, you're not going to be able to legitimately claim state sovereignty unless you have minimized the risk of exclusion and you have prevented the right from being violated. And so that's where we see that, in fact, we don't have merely an obligation to address when the kind of negative mobility outcomes have emerged, but also to prevent those negative mobility outcomes from occurring in the first place. So this is beneficial in that it grounds obligations to address various degrees of agency. So, for example, in cases where there are low degrees of agency, the obligation amounts to some sort of intervention that can bolster that or can help to buttress or increase that notion of agency. And where there are high degrees of agency, there's an obligation to continue to facilitate that. So, for example, what ways can you make external migration easier? Right? Are there certain kinds of shared schemas that allow for that? But also, what ways can you allow people to stay in place in ways where exposure to risk is limited? And so there's some aspects here, right, that it's addressing that the others aren't. But another key feature that we like to stress about this account is the way in which it really centers the notion of agency, which we think is really important, particularly with climate mobilities. When I talked about the notion of livability, it really is about this relational component, about how you're able to shape the spaces that you find yourself occupying. And so that means that ensuring livability is not just ensuring basic sets of resources, but also access to certain kinds of knowledge integration, being able to actually play a key participatory role in the decision making about what to do about your mobility outcome, right? So it really helps to lay a foundation for why there can't just be top-down measures where states dictate what certain communities and individuals ought to be doing, but a bottom-up approach where the very kinds of participation within community decision making itself ought to be amplified as a requirement of the obligation. Okay, some of the things that it also avoids that I'll mention briefly here before trying to put it in action is that other kinds of frameworks really require identifying a direct cause in order to identify who is responsible. So, the reason why we ought to intervene in the case of, a refugee crisis, well, we see that there are the exclusion that has happened in the state, and when the refugee arrives on your shores, you are then responsible, because if you were to send them back, you would be responsible for the harms that they would be exposed to. Now, in the case of climate change and climate mobilities, I explained briefly, right, how complex these procedures are. Migration in general and migration decisions are very obscure to try to pick apart. It's very hard to identify that storm or that degree of increase or that level of sea level rise was the specific isolated reason for why someone moves or why someone is stuck. Part of the reason why, for example, the refugee paradigm is hard is because it would be really, really hard to prove, right, the reason for movement, because it is this integration in a number of different kinds of elements that go into choice and decision making. And so rather than having to identify climate impacts or the exposure to climate impacts as the direct causal link for the climate mobility outcome, our view is rather taking a more general causal approach and saying, look, the things that render people vulnerable to climate impacts, where their mobility can be negatively impacted, is due to the very nature of the structure of the state system itself under conditions of climate change. And we cannot keep continuing on as normal like we did prior to the impacts of climate change when the Westphalian system has been introduced. So we kind of skirt some attribution challenges. Now, over time, climate attribution errors will hopefully continue to lessen. But for what it's worth now, we're arguing you don't need to identify a really strict causal pattern in order to get the obligation up and running. Similarly, just to note, our account doesn't specify any one particular actor as the one that's causally responsible, but rather when someone is claiming protection, their claim is addressing the state system as a whole. So there's a notion of kind of shared responsibility where the account is giving principled reasons for why, wealthy states, for example, can't say that's not my problem because it's not happening in my region. And finally, we find a strength of the view is that it really illustrates, given this notion of shared responsibility, why an international governance mechanism is itself important, why it can't just be done on individual state level or city level, address, why you actually need some sort of international agreements on how to fulfill our obligations to protect people when their mobility is impacted. And so this brings me kind of to the way that the framework we're putting to work in the policy and governance space, which is, the dominant focus of this particular work that I'm doing with Alen. Now, I won't get too much into background of the Paris Agreement, and thank you, Yolandi. I see I have about 10 minutes or so. But we're arguing that in the international governance scheme addressing climate change in general,
it looks like we've lost Simona. Let's just see. There we go.
There we go. Okay. Looks like call was dropped.
Yeah. You've also lost your screen. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing your screen again.
Yep. No worries. Sorry. sorry guys, I don't know what happened. Okay. You able to see?
There we go. Yeah, 100%. You can just carry on.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, so why is the Paris Agreement best suited? We think because it is the kind of framework that mirrors this normative framework we've introduced and can carry out the obligations as such. Namely, it's one of the only international governance mechanisms addressing climate mobility that has the potential to address movement and immobility. It also, we're going to argue, has the potential to uphold those ex ante and ex post protection claims. Furthermore, its very responsibility structure mirrors the livability framework. And it's moved away from a kind of name and blame case that we had seen in prior accounts of international governance that preceded the Paris Agreement. So, just try to advance. Okay. Contrary to other international governance institutions that are relevant for climate mobilities, the Paris Agreement has this setup where those two benefits that I mentioned, its ability to address both movement and immobility and its ability to uphold ex ante and ex post claims, are buttressed by their availability, that the very pillars within the Paris Agreement can be the ways in which this obligation is discharged. Like I said, the Paris Agreement set out a notion of responsibility where it has a catalytic structure. It has a responsibility that is not based on common but differentiated responsibilities or respective capabilities, which was the original kind of framework that you saw emerge in the Kyoto Protocol. Instead, it offers this new approach to responsibility when it emerged right in the early 2000s and then eventually was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which is, in lieu of debating how to share the burden of efforts about climate, each country was invited to propose certain kinds of contributions that would detail what it was ready to do, and that would sort of have a ratcheting effect about how these kinds of different climate impacts would be addressed. So it included a both bottom-up and top-down approach with certain kind of action-specific rules that we argue are well suited to the climate mobilities issue. Because you can see how decision makers can use the flexibility of the Paris structure to develop rules for policy responses to those different mobility outcomes that could have a global scope, but also could be sensitive to context-specific needs. Now, all that being said, currently, as I mentioned earlier, the Paris Agreement currently kind of shoves most of the conversation about addressing climate mobilities and most of the obligations into the loss and damage pillar. And so we've argued that those normative definitions of L&D as they currently stand, regardless of those two interpretations I mentioned earlier, don't actually account for immobility outcomes resulting from climate change. So they're missing on that scope. And they're not able to establish preemptive claims to protection. So its responsibility nexus is also lacking. Also in this context, we're trying to raise the question of, if we're trying to figure out how the Paris Agreement can be best utilized given its potential that I mentioned earlier to address climate mobilities, what about it needs to change? What about the status quo of the way it addresses climate mobility and its relationship to loss and damage? How ought we think about certain kinds of developments ought to occur? So we give two options, and I'm going to talk them briefly and then, end the conversation here with some brief discussions of their limitations. But mainly we say, well, so far, if you want to revise the status quo of Paris to better address climate mobility's outcomes, in particular to satisfy the obligation to protect the right to a livable locality, you can do at least two things we see. One, you can currently adhere closely to the current understanding of loss and damage and understanding it as distinct from the adaptation pillar. So in the current understanding of loss and damage, this is where you have that compensatory framework that I discussed earlier. That's currently how the status quo is. But we say, if you stick with this status quo and you understand L&D as distinct from adaptation in the ways that we outlined earlier, then the livability framework requires the Paris Agreement to dislodge climate mobility's addresses, not just in the loss and damage pillar, but also in the adaptation pillar, so that the governance of climate mobilities would span both pillars, which means loss and damage could take care of ex post claims, right, when the harms have already kicked in. But the adaptation pillar can help to satisfy the obligation to address ex ante claims. So to summarize, option one is stick to the current trajectory of understanding L&D normatively as it's understood, so you don't make any changes to its sort of normative conceptualizing, seeing it mostly as this reparative and backwards looking thing to address these harms. But then you got to take climate mobilities and also add it into part of the adaptation pillar. So the financing mechanisms that come out of that, the obligations that the adaptation pillar puts forward should also include climate mobilities. Now, there may be some shortcomings with this approach. Some limitations include that it could lead to like duplication. So both pillars would end up maybe covering the same mobility outcome in that nexus that I talked about with the, the 4 quadrants. But maybe that's not so bad, depending on how you think about it. But it also could have some misses, meaning some outcomes, if there is that duplication, would not be covered. So there would have to be, a type of mapping out that would avoid those. But there is another option forward if you don't like those kinds of limitations. The second major option that you could do is not preserve the same normative conception of L&D and rather expand it. And you're going to have to expand it in a way to address the full range of climate mobility outcomes, so that the governance of climate mobilities can remain entirely confined to L&D, but then L&D really needs to include forward-looking responsibilities for protection. Now, some folks might argue that you're not able to address forward-looking notions of responsibility in a largely compensatory or reparative framework, although other folks argue that there might actually be the case to do so. For example, you might see that in light of the potential for that kind of risk, there's a compensatory framework to address the very conditions of that allow that risk to exist. So maybe there's a way to kind of circumnavigate that. So in short, one could argue that backward-looking responsibility can still ground requirements to pay for future-oriented adaptation costs if responsibility is determined by like whatever past actions that had contributed to the risks and the need for intervention in the first place. But in any case, this option at least requires us to consider, is merely a compensatory framework of L&D sufficient? And some might say there are some limitations in that it's not. Some might say if you change the normative notion of L&D too much, you're getting away from what was hard fought to get it in the Paris Agreement to begin with. Also, there's the chance that the financing that would come from the loss and damage pillar would really only be applied to the most severe cases of displacement, therefore limiting it. So both options, right, had their types of limitations, but what we wanted to do was this mapping of the potential of which, kind of direction you want to go in order to evaluate what are we valuing when we are, and how to be more clear about how those valued assumptions are being entered in when we're structuring the particular governance scheme to meet these obligations. So to summarize, right, you can potentially understand the Paris Agreement as a really strong potential governance mechanism. We currently in this paper are remaining agnostic. We're not arguing for one option over another, but rather arguing that as a whole, future development of loss and damage implementation has significant implications for the Paris Agreement's ability to actually deal with climate mobilities. And if you want to better have it used to address climate mobilities, you need to think about these different options and how to construct the L&D pillar. Either you understand the L&D pillar as it's understood, but then you need to address climate mobilities also in the adaptation pillar, or you keep climate mobilities within the loss and damage pillar, but then you need to expand your conception of L&D. The bigger takeaway that we also want to have highlighted, and what I'll end with here, is that we're arguing that by considering L&D, loss and damage implementation through the lens of climate mobilities and our livability framework, we're actually encouraging and enabling a clearer understanding about what loss and damage is and how it ought to be implemented, which is extremely relevant given that this ground is currently untrodden as of yet and is some of the biggest pressing questions, particularly moving into the next COP. And that our livability framework is advantageous in that it provides a principled basis for the revision of the status quo. It identifies why we have obligations to address both ex ante and ex post claims to protection, and that those responsibilities are generated from our shared understandings of the current way the global regime is structured in that territorial state system. So you don't need any kind of more controversial external notion of moral principles, right? If you are granting that we're understanding the state system in these ways and you take that system to be legitimate, then protecting the right to a livable locality is a legitimacy condition you have to meet in order for that whole system to be justified. And that finally, the livability framework demonstrates why an international governance mechanism is required in order to address the shared notion of responsibility to address climate mobilities, and that the Paris Agreement itself can help to be a helpful mechanism in order to satisfy those obligations. So I will end there, and I am happy to answer any questions, to continue to elaborate on anything that maybe needs further clarification. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I think we can all give her a virtual sort of round of applause, either through reactions or through, I don't know, some cosmic energy, or I'm not sure. Thank you so much, Simona. I think that has given us a lot of food for thought, especially as we find ourselves in Africa, where we already have a lot of migration for various different reasons, including, I think, climate issues. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions and answers. So I'm kind of keeping my eye on whether there's any raised hands. If you've got a question. While we're kind of waiting for perhaps people to formulate their questions, I mean, so obviously this is a normative framework, right? So this idea of a right, and I'm assuming you mean a kind of moral right, or do you mean a kind of strictly legal right? Is this something you foresee kind of building out into a legal right? Because I can imagine there's many other reasons besides climates that make spaces unlivable, right? So the right to livability, I can have an unlivable space even if I live in the perfect climate, or I'm not affected by climate, or whatever the case might be. So kind of maybe you can say a bit more about this right, like how you envision this right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because it enables me to also talk about like why livability I find is a really helpful concept. So I take that like Henry Shue notion of a basic right. So understanding it as a moral right, and also could be understood to some extent as a political right, but as a basic right, it's satisfaction, right? Being able to obtain it, being able to preserve access to that kind of right enables you to then claim all sorts of other kinds of rights. So like if you don't maintain a right to a livable space, then you're not going to be able to claim such things as a right to political participation, right? Or a right to some sorts of affordances that citizenship gives you. So that's kind of the basic underlying framework of the nature of that kind of right. To your later question about livability itself, 100% agree. When I have been developing this normative account, I don't see it specific to climate mobilities, but rather understand the framework as a helpful way to articulate the nature of the moral problem of climate mobilities that might be shared in other kinds of cases. So in other kinds of work, I'm particularly interested in issues of housing justice, housing insecurity, and the issue and intersections with climate change, obviously. But there are many cases in which the right to livability has been violated just in like conditions of housing insecurity apart from climate. Or it might amount to certain kinds of abolitionist arguments around incarceration, because presumably we can talk about why that basic right is not satisfied, right? Especially if you have lost that kind of co-constitutive relationship to those spaces. And so we tend to argue that the notion of livability itself as being relatively expansive and being able to capture other kinds of phenomena, other kinds of moral wrongs besides negative climate mobilities as like a feature, not a bug of the account. And part of the reason why we take that to be advantageous is that, as I was, gesturing towards, the climate mobility issue, because it's so complex, often doesn't look like a climate mobility issue. So for example, housing insecurity doesn't, on the face of it, look like a climate mobility issue, but it in fact might actually be, right, depending on the particular context within which that housing insecurity is a case. And so part of the problem with climate mobilities, it's these like globally impacted phenomena expressed, like most climate things, right, in these very contextualized ways, right, very specific to particular kinds of areas, communities, that sort of a thing. And the problem with overgeneralizing what climate mobilities looks like, and therefore overgeneralizing the nature of the obligations that we have, then maybe misses cases in which we actually are obligated to intervene, because intervening, right, is the kinds of things needed to address the climate mobilities issue to begin with. So livability helps you to actually think a lot broader than, what is commonly understood when we're just thinking about that sort of thing. So I can give some concrete examples because I understand livability is a type of functioning. So I kind of use some capabilities approach stuff, where it's a type of end that ought to be secured. And it is a type of end that ought to be secured in light of how we understand the state system. But that might mean, for example, that certain kinds of aspects of discharging the obligation might be epistemic, right? What ways can we enable certain kinds of communities to access and utilize their traditional knowledge frameworks to better adapt? That is a climate mobilities issue, right? Because it helps to build that co-constitutive relationship to space, things like that. So there's both material and non-material elements that go into the nature of the obligation, and that's what we're trying to express with the notion of livability.
Yeah.
Oh, and to your point about the legal thing too, in the book that I'm working on, one question is this like governance mechanism with the Paris Agreement, but another thing I've been thinking through a lot is how a human rights framework can include livability as one of the nexus of rights within a human rights legal framework.
I guess it could also be connected to kind of a right to dignity or something like that, right?
So yeah, self-determination, right? All these kinds of things. I mean, I think you're right about dignity. There's issues particularly within livability that stress agency, right? So if you don't have a particular, secured notion of agency here, but not merely agency. So, I was recently listening to a talk by Jola Ajibade, who works on managed retreat and a number of other issues, and was explaining to us how, I forgot where the particular community was, but there was a very high degree of agency in the decision making there. Like the community decided we're going to like get up and move, right, and started to migrate. When they got to the locations where they had a high degree to decide, of agency to decide where they were going to stay put, they didn't have any kind of governmental support, not just for the movement, but also how to be integrated in the new space. Yeah. And so that amounted to a type of failure. So livability is trying to capture like why agency, of course, is important. It might be necessary, but it certainly may not be sufficient. There might be other things that need to bolster that kind of support.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, while there's no other questions coming up, I'm going to abuse my position as chair.
Yeah, sure.
Chantal, thanks. I'll give you a chance now. So this might be a very silly question, right? But obviously I think a lot also about animals. Would you extend this right of livability to animals as well? Because I imagine they're also a massive victim of climate change, right? So that's my question. And then Chantal, when Simona's done answering, you can ask your question.
Yeah, again, so stoked you answered or asked that question. I am in fact working on a paper that's adapting the livability framework for conservation practices in particular, and looking at the non-human world, not just animals, but also plant species as well. So yes, absolutely. So the interesting thing in these cases, so I'm working on with two co-authors on that paper that work in environmental ethics and conservation ethics. And there we're looking at how these kinds of requirements of livability force us to have to reconsider certain kinds of basic operating assumptions that have, kind of underlied a lot of conservation practices. So, most conservation practices talk about like preservation in place, and tend to then focus on when those kinds of spaces start to look different, because you start to see maybe another species moving into that space. We, designate those species as invasive, therefore problematic, have to be extricated. But under a shifting climate niche, right, where both you're going to have climate tracking species that need to move across these kinds of territorial regions, right, or move out of the spaces they've currently occupied, it really presses us to ask these kinds of questions about whether we can preserve the same kinds of underlying assumptions and whether it's morally necessary for us to think about what we owe in a little more expansive way. And so in this paper, we're looking at 4 different kinds of test cases of where you've got like species that have moved into an area where they're doing no harm in that area, looking at different cases of where facilitated migration might need to be an increasing conservation practice, and some other cases where if you were to extricate the species from the new areas it moved in, it would then become extinct, right? So there's all these different kinds of complexities. There are some differences in the sense that you know, we have to understand what it means for species to be engaging in that kind of co-constitutive way. So in this paper, we're trying to tease out the parallels between the relational conceptions that I have in the human mobility case to the relations we have in the ecosystem case as well. So that's emerging work that I'm really hoping actually to apply and send to you for, you know, upcoming conference and stuff like that, because I do think it helps to set a framework for really, you know, stepping back, much like the human mobility question does, to really step back and look at the kinds of governance mechanisms in general that the basic underlying assumptions are no longer sufficient for, given climate change.
Awesome. Chantal?
Cool. Hi, Simona. Thanks so much. Great talk. I was just wondering, you know, in terms of developing this framework and obligations, there's so much bad rhetoric and xenophobic rhetoric around migrants. So I was wondering, you know, we can have these wonderful frameworks, but we have these very competing mechanisms for making meaning. And so, you know, in South Africa, for example, a lot of the xenophobic rhetoric is quite emotionally charged around taking our jobs. You know, it's the same in the US, I know. So I'm just wondering, how do we start, you know, what are our obligations in starting to change people's perceptions around that? Because obviously, sort of climate migration is maybe going to become a very big thing in future.
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. And it's in fact what led me into this research, because I'm a political philosopher, was my sort of dissatisfaction with how the narratives around these sorts of issues immediately trigger these kinds of xenophobic tendencies, and particularly claims to framing the climate mobilities issue as a national security issue. Now, some people might argue that it's advantageous because that will help motivate and mobilize resources. But what we're trying to do in advancing this framework is to show how we need to re-articulate the nature of the moral problem, and therefore how to re-articulate how we then see the pragmatic problem and how we understand responsibility in light of that, and also to diffuse the kind of, you know, widespread misinformation that ends up wrapping as a, you know, this problem as a package. So, for example, it's been used both in the US and elsewhere, particularly if you're looking at Latin American migration in the US. Many people that were working, you know, journalists that work in the space that are, you know, doing good work, I think try to put the sense of urgency into the problem by making it like this big mass movement, right, across borders conception, right? When actually the percentage of the phenomena, like I said, across cross-border movement is actually relatively small and can be kept, you know, to some extent understood as it can be collaboratively managed, rather than waiting for certain kinds of systems to fail and then seeing maybe external migration as an increasing phenomena. But most people are talking about it as the only aspect of the phenomena, as the emergent phenomena. There are good faith actors that are using that because they think doing that will inspire action. And then there are, of course, bad faith actors like states that use it as a form of disinformation to then trigger, you know, the usual xenophobic tendencies, both in terms of labor stealing, and that sort of a thing. And I think that then to answer the question about what we do about this sort of thing, both can respond to how you respond to xenophobic framings to begin with, but also when you're doing this research, to not feed the kind of those kinds of narratives any kind of sense of legitimacy. So why livability might be a helpful framework, and why I talk about this problem as a livability issue, is to show the ways that there are commonalities. Of course, some people more than others might be impacted, but to show that, for example, the climate mobilities issue is also an immobility issue, and that if you're worried about like wide scale displacement across borders, nation states, right, that are pushing the national security framework, then you ought to be investing in ways to facilitate in situ adaptation. Again, not as a top-down approach, but seeing that more successful approaches will require that integration of communities themselves. And so I think your question speaks to the larger challenge, of course, about fighting disinformation, but I am extremely keen on looking at the ways in which narrative frameworks work. Another reason why the livability framework is one that I find to be advantageous over others is because its stressing of agency means that the people that are impacted are not merely victims. So if you look at some of the language from leaders in the Pacific Islands that have been advocating a lot, on this frame of addressing climate migration in particular. There's some, choice quotes from the former president of Kiribati, Anatantang, who said, we're not victims. We're just trying to claim rights that we should be afforded to have. And so I take this kind of account as lending legitimacy to those frameworks, right? Like I said, part of what satisfying these obligations may amount to allowing people to have some more sense of self-determination and control over those kinds of engagements. And then when it comes to labor threats, there's the question about if you have structured agreements. So for example, if part of the ways to discharge the obligation are to establish in advance certain kinds of like labor visas and things like that, you can do so in a principled way. So it's not then this ad hoc, sort of like humanitarian framework. And so that's like part of the narrative shifts. And then the questions about fighting disinformation, I think, are larger political questions about the ways in which we need to be bolstering certain kinds of institutions, particularly democratic institutions, and understand the way information flows. But in just talking every day to people, one, trying to start to talk about the complexity of this issue, about it not being just this cross-border migration issue, but to, I guess, assuage some people's worries that all of a sudden overnight they're going to see, what Europeans are trying to do in the same case with the Syrian refugee crisis, and right now the xenophobic practices in the UK, is to demonstrate not only that the phenomena is not what they're characterizing at, but that they are failing to meet really basic obligations that establish the very legitimacy for them to claim sovereignty in the first place. So the point is to say, you cannot advance an immigration policy that claims the right to exclude people if people's right to livability is not being met, because the right to sovereignty is afforded to you by the social practice of the state system, and that social practice itself is not legitimate if livability is not protected. So trying to show how actually requirements of livability undergird all of that. I'm not sure if that's helped satisfy. But you're right that we're in increasingly, you're seeing the rise of these kinds of xenophobic, fascist tendencies. So it's something that we all are.
I think you're right in saying it is a larger problem of disinformation, misinformation, and I think that, that is actually a very large problem all on its own. Never mind related to climate. So yeah, I agree. It's a big picture kind of thing to tackle.
I tend to get really frustrated when, because I think it makes for good headlines too. I'm not even talking about the bad actors with misinformation, but even the good actors that really want to care about the problem. Oftentimes climate migration or climate refugees, right, is the easiest thing that people think to scare people into action.
Yeah.
And I think that is a little perverse. I see really, good climate reporters and stuff falling victim into this and having the same images of people walking across a desert landscape, right, or the sinking islands. And these images both don't talk to the resilience and agency of these populations, but it also is a threat. You should really care and do something about climate because then this will happen. And maybe that's a threat to people to not want to see mass human suffering. But to me, I think the tendency always then tends to be these kinds of like knee-jerk kind of nationalist claims that then come in. So that's why I'm hesitant to rely on like humanitarian frameworks, like, oh, it should just be that we should get ahead of these things as issues of charity. It's like, no, like if if you're going to claim certain aspects of national sovereignty, you're going to have to address this case.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that great question.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the floor? I don't see any hands up or anything in the chat, although I haven't, no, there's nothing in the chat either. Okay, well then I think that brings us to an end. Thank you so much. You've definitely given me quite a lot to think about, as I generally don't think about, these kinds of things in this kind of way. I'm just thinking like how hard it is to just get a visa as an African trying to visit. Like, I'm like I don't think the threat administratively is even that big. I mean, it's just like impossible for us to even visit places.
Yeah, the bureaucracy. No, I mean, this is a huge thing. I mean, if I can pontificate more on this too, there's like that issue in particular with research, and then there's the particular kind of philosophy of immigration aspect that you're addressing. And taking the first one, a lot of important work on climate mobilities can be done by researchers on the ground, like embedded in the areas that they are in. But when you have the majority of climate research being done by global north researchers that only then use partnerships with researchers in the global south as sort of like the people on the ground doing field work, you really lose then the real possibility for input of even framing certain solutions and questions to be asked. So I think that's a major problem in terms of scholarship that increasingly needs to be addressed. It's not particular to this issue, of course, but and then the second kind of thing that grinds my gears a bit about this is that like we tend to always fall into the operating assumption that immigration policies alone, the major underlying normative reason for them to exist is to stop immigration. So anytime most states want to claim that their immigration policies are working, they tend to cite all the numbers of people that they've stopped for coming, or they tend to show, look what we're doing from preventing certain students or researchers from coming to our areas or taking our jobs and this sort of thing. And there's some really great work by a lot of contemporary philosophers of immigration that are really getting at this sort of work. Alex Sager, for example, argues that externalized border processes, like when you have other countries kind of fulfilling your immigration policy, those are atrocious right now. Think about the UK Rwanda policy, for example. Are they inherently morally wrong? Well, maybe not if we switch the underlying assumption to not be about stopping migration, blocking people, but actually facilitating movement to begin with. So in that paper on externalization and the sort of moral, juice behind it, like in the case of climate mobilities, we are going to need to understand these obligations to coordinate and to work. But that then has to have us to require a different underlying assumption to begin with, that human movement is not something that our institutions ought to be preventing, but rather how can it be facilitated in a just way. And I think we constantly, those of us that have passport privilege, those of us that are in the global north, those of us that are researching are not materially impacted by this, like don't have the phenomenological experience of doing that. And when I teach about this stuff to my students, I talk about like the anger I feel every single time I'm in an airport, like going through customs and things like that. And like I said, with a tremendous amount of privilege. I'm, dual citizen, American, white, I'm educated. I don't have any problem moving through most spaces. And yet still there just seems to be like this overarching crushing of agency, right, that happens in those kinds of spaces. So in the work that I'm trying to do around climate mobilities, and if you're all interested, and this is something I'll kind of flag, I've been running a spring speaker series on climate mobility. So if you want to hear lots of different people talking about these kinds of issues, you're more than welcome to see the recordings of that. I can send it to you, you can pass it around. But I also have a working group that's interdisciplinary from different regions. And we're hoping to have a conference next year supported and hosted by Princeton, which is also going to be specifically working at getting at those structural issues, particularly of connecting, building the kinds of questions from researchers from all over, but also bringing in community leaders and policymakers to have access to one another, to be co-constructing the kind of research that this space needs. So we're trying to think of some experimental mechanisms through even just like an academic conference and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in all of that, or if you know researchers and folks that will be involved, I'm like super happy to engage with folks on that too.
Yeah, please just send stuff to me and I'll send it to our networks here as well. And I hope I'm seeing you in South Africa next year.
I'm going to send you that abstract of that paper, and I already told my colleague, and he's like, let's do it. So
that's awesome.
Hopefully I'll be there in situ.
Yay, thank you so much, Simona. This has been a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, if we have any questions, is it okay if we pop you an email or whatever?
It's widely accessible. Use my Durham email. That's the one that I'm probably most likely to respond to. And if you want to get on the mailing list for the Climate Mobilities Research Group, I'll add you onto that. So feel free, if questions come up after this, you're welcome to be me.
Thanks again, and I really appreciate you giving us some of your time today. And thank you everyone for joining. And that then concludes our talk today. And bye, I guess. Everyone.
Thank you so much, Yolandi. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.